Greetings and welcome. My name is Daniel Lazar, and it is my humble privilege and my pleasure to be here with you and to support you in your pursuit of United States history. Today's talk is called Domestic Policies in the Age of Camelot. And in this talk, I'm going to try to walk you through the extent to which the Kennedy administration was able to fulfill its ambitious promise to the American people that they would safely usher the American people into new frontiers. It is a talk exclusively about the domestic agenda of the Kennedy administration, beginning, we will, with the 1960 election, a total barn burner, a landmark election in American history, a tight one, and spoiler alert, the Kennedy team won. Armed with that victory, we'll talk about at some length the civil rights agenda, what its ambitions were and where it fell short and why it fell short. We'll then talk about the Kennedy administration's attack on women's rights, economic human rights, and then we'll talk about the Apollo mission and the Peace Corps, which, while they don't nest comfortably under the banner of the domestic agenda, they do, in fact, have international and interplanetary dimensions. Both the Apollo mission and the Peace Corps had a substantial effect on domestic politics, which we'll talk about. And sadly, we'll have to talk, albeit briefly, about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What we will not be talking about is this image on the right, which is when JFK visits Berlin in June of 1963. We won't be talking about JFK's foreign policies at all. While deeply interesting and about which I have much to say, as it were, that's not in the purview of this particular talk. That will come up in class or perhaps in another talk I give another time. So let's dive right into it. Let's get into the election of 1960 by talking at first about the by-election of 1958. Now, if you're taking this class with me, then you know that off-year elections, sometimes called by-elections, have a certain predictive potential, which is to say, in a contemporary context, in 2018, the Democrats did well. They did not hold the executive office, but they did gain some governorships, and they recontrolled the House of Representatives. They gained control of the House of Representatives, and so they had some momentum. We look at by-elections or off-year elections to kind of take the temperature of the political climate. And if we were to take the temperature of American politics in 1958, things were looking, to say the very least, hopeful for the Democratic Party. Dwight Eisenhower, who was a popular president, was halfway through his second term, and his momentum was slowing down. He himself was getting older. And of course, despite how popular he was, he could not run for a third term. The Republican Party, which he nominally led, had brought the American people into a short, sharp recession. In retrospect, the 1958 recession was a big nothing burger, but at the time, a lot of people who had lived through the Great Depression were deeply scared that 1958 could have rhymed with 1929. Now, of course, that obviously didn't happen, but there were anxieties, there were perceptions, and as these things go, perceptions can be more powerful than reality in the game of politics. So the economic growth, the unparalleled economic growth of post-war America was being put into question, and to the extent to which the economy started to slide, it was going to be pinned on the Republican Party, who was in power in the executive branch. The Republicans also had lowered the farm price supports that were created by the Roosevelt administration. So the farmers were moving towards the Democratic Party, as was organized labor, particularly the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization, the AFL-CIO, the two biggest unions in America. They were in strong opposition to the so-called right-to-work laws that Republicans were advocating on a state-by-state level. So you have the farmers and the laborers, both of which were moving towards the Democratic Party. And then the Republicans were increasingly seen as being, dare I say it, soft on communism. There was a perception, which again, in retrospect, is ridiculous. The historical record does not support this perception, that the Soviets were getting ahead, that the Soviets were not only winning the race to space, they had launched Sputnik into orbit, the satellite, in 1957, but also this notion that the Soviets were winning the nuclear arms race, right? And there wasn't, and Tom Gervasi wrote a book about it, The Myth of Soviet Military Supremacy. It is clearly documented that the United States was never behind, was always very far ahead in the arms race. But again, perception is sometimes more powerful than reality in the convoluted game of American politics. And so to the extent to which the Americans believed that America was falling behind, that was going to be pinned on the president. So for these reasons, in 1958, the Democrats performed splendidly. They gained 15 seats in the Senate, 48 seats in the House, which is a huge swing, and 6 governorships. So they had a 2-to-1 margin and in Congress. And the Democrats controlled Congress with very few interruption between 1933 and 1980, as we've talked about and will continue to talk about. So the stakes were high. The Democrats were in a great position. They had the momentum. And so whoever got the 1960 Democratic ticket, whoever won that ticket at the convention, was perched to succeed, or at least to compete well. So in Los Angeles, they started with 10 candidates. They were down to 5, the top 3 of which were Adlai Stevenson from the fine state of Illinois, former governor of Illinois, and a 2-time presidential loser. He had lost to Eisenhower handily twice. It didn't seem like the Democrats were particularly interested in going with the 2-time loser. They had gone with William Jennings Bryan over and over again at the turn of the century, and no need to repeat that mistake. But the distinguished gentleman from Illinois did put his hat in the ring, and he was, while not summarily dismissed, the convention moved on quickly. Pretty quickly, it became a 2-man race between Lyndon Johnson, the great senator, who we will talk about in great detail in my next talk when we get into the Johnson administration. Johnson, in addition to having a broad lexicon of political experience and having a reputation for getting things done in Congress, he also appealed to the South. He was a Texan, and there was a belief that Lyndon Johnson could not only deliver the South to the Democratic Party, but that he could deliver rural regions in the Midwest as well. So LBJ, both because of his upbringing and his ability to speak to rural and Southern people, and because what he accomplished, his robust record, LBJ was the front runner. But John F. Kennedy had a remarkable appeal, and much has been written about the appeal of JFK. And frankly, it's hard to deny the appeal of JFK. Yeah? And his appeal, JFK's appeal to the youth, to the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and to to a lot of enthusiastic voters, JFK breathed new life into the convention. And for that reason, he was chosen on the first ballot. Lyndon Johnson never got over this. Lyndon Johnson believed, quite rightly, if I may, that he had earned the Democratic Party's confidence and that he should hold the highest office for that reason. The Democratic Party, in fact, thought it would be best to have Lyndon Johnson do what he had continued to do, what he had shown such an acumen at, which was to be the lion of the Senate. Why take him out of that position when he had performed so splendidly in it? Why promote the guy who was doing a near perfect job at the task at hand? Johnson never got over it. He said, perhaps infamously, and it's a bit crude and crass, but not too crude and crass for this guy, quote, "I now know the difference between a caucus, the Democratic caucus who makes a decision, and a cactus. In a cactus, all the pricks are on the outside." So here's Lyndon Johnson in the way that Lyndon Johnson does, showing his frustration with the Democratic Party. And it's worth pointing out that he was always frustrated to his bitter death. 13 years later, he was always bitter with the Democratic Party and the Kennedy family for, in his mind, stealing the nomination from him. And it was thus such a shock to him when JFK, through his brother, Bobby Kennedy, showed up in Lyndon Johnson's hotel room to ask him if he would be on the ticket as vice president. The rumor has it, I don't think that this is clear in the historical record, that Bobby Kennedy went to offer the vice presidential position to LBJ as a courtesy, not expecting that he would take it. And Johnson, to the surprise and very much to the dismay of Bobby Kennedy, accepted the offer. And thus begins a drama and a saga, which is the purview of a later talk. In Chicago, my hometown, the Republicans chose Vice President Richard Nixon with Henry Cabot Lodge as vice president on the first ballot. There was no real contentious convention there. So the stage is set. We have a two-person race, JFK versus Richard Nixon. And then accepting the nomination from the Democratic Party, JFK said, "The times are too grave, the challenge too urgent, and the stakes too high to permit the customary passions of political debate. We're not here to curse the darkness, but to light the candle that can guide us through that darkness to a safe and sane future. Today, our concern must be with that future. For the world is changing. The old era is ending. The old ways will not do. It is a time, in short, for a new generation of leadership." So a couple of thoughts about this. First, his poetic prose speaks to the ages. It is as fresh today to me, to my ears, as it was 70 years ago. 60 years ago. Not a math class. But also, this is the kind of the essence of JFK. We're not here to curse the darkness. We're not here to dig into the pain of the past and the Depression and the World War and the darkness of the Cold War. We need to look towards a brighter future. Yeah. And we need a new generation, the young generation, to stand up and fight for what they believe in. So I was always inspired by JFK as a young man. I continue to be inspired by JFK. I work at a school that bears his name. So he challenged the American people to to stand up and fight for what they believe in and to think about the future and to create a vision for the future. And he himself had a vision for the future. He called it his new frontier. And he saw himself as standing on the shoulders of giants who had created sort of an evolutionary path towards what JFK called this new frontier. He harks back to Woodrow Wilson. He says, Woodrow Wilson's new freedom promised our nation a new political and economic framework. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal promised security and succor to those in need. But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, it's a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. It appeals to their pride, not their pocketbook. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. So again, JFK saw himself as a leader, and he was certainly, but he saw himself as a leader of people who were willing to make sacrifices, who were willing to work together, who were willing to work with him and to follow him towards a new frontier. This is visionary leadership, and it's very much the case, and we'll talk more about it later, that JFK goes down in American presidential history as one of the great visionaries. He had a certain proclivity towards visionary leadership, but vision alone makes not a great president. Right? One needs to follow through. One needs to accomplish that vision. There's a lot of boots on the ground action that has to happen, and we will assess the degree to which Kennedy was able to fulfill the vision. More than just soaring rhetoric, accomplishment. Right? So, in order to enjoy those accomplishments, he was going to have to win the election. And in order to win the election, he was going to have to deal with what I am loosely calling here the Catholic conundrum. If you've been taking this class with me, you know that throughout American history, with peaks and valleys, but think about the 1830s and 40s, you think about the 1870s and 80s, Catholics were seen not just as another race of people, the Catholic race. They were seen as an inferior race, and in some cases a subhuman, literally subhuman race. Thomas Nast, sharing these images of subhuman Catholics. I can't emphasize enough the degree to which Catholics were discriminated against throughout U.S. history. And I know that in a contemporary context, Catholics aren't usually put into the lexicon of traditionally discriminated against groups, but they very much were. And while in retrospect, it doesn't seem so phenomenal that America should have a Catholic president, it was quite a phenomenon. And it was a phenomenon that was achieved by quite a juggernaut. JFK had a charisma, a kindness, and a charm that very much worked in his favor, particularly in this context, in his ability to reach out to the American people, to Protestants in particular, and to tell them, and I'm quoting here, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be Catholic. I don't speak for my church on public matters. And importantly, the church doesn't speak for me. There was this notion that Catholics could not be American, that Kennedy was going to take orders from the Pope, that his loyalty to the Pope was greater than his loyalty to America. And he met with a bunch of Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas. Lyndon Johnson helped to set this up. And I've linked here in my PowerPoint to a collection of his most charming remarks. He made the Protestant ministers laugh. He made them smile. He made them feel. And in this speech, he won over a substantial enough portion of the Protestant community that he was able to walk into the Oval Office. Of course, that alone didn't get him into the highest office, but it was necessary for the young Catholic aspirant to speak to the whole country and to speak to the Protestant community in particular. Now, if I could just pause here to say two things. First, this PowerPoint and all of my lectures are available at www.daniellazar.com. And if you want to pull up my slides, you're welcome to them. They're free, of course. And so you can link to that speech through the PowerPoint if you want. And secondly, I want to begin to draw this Venn diagram between the young John F. Kennedy and the young Barack Obama. Just like Kennedy had to convince the American people, and Protestants in particular, that he was there to represent all Americans, that he was an American first before he was a Catholic, Barack Obama had to give a speech where he had to convince the American people that he was not seeking to be the Black president, but the president who happened to be Black. And that he was not going to speak for the Black community, that he was going to exclusively, at least, he was going to speak for all Americans. And that his identity as Black, which he was proud of, and he had every right and reason to be proud of, did not define him. It was just an important part, but a part of his identity. And so the JFK Obama parallels are many and maybe meaningful. I don't know. We'll get more into them later in this talk. We could talk about it in class also. There are limits to these comparisons in the same way there are limits to comparisons between any two people. But with those 2 points noted, JFK was able, through charm and grace and empathy, to overcome the Catholic conundrum up to a point. Look, a lot of people didn't vote at all because they wouldn't vote for a Catholic. A lot of people voted for Nixon because he wasn't a Catholic. And the numbers on that are a matter of some historical debate. We don't know exactly how many people cast a ballot for Nixon or stayed at home because of the Catholic conundrum. But it played a role. It continued to play a role. He didn't totally dispel the Catholic problem, right? So he had to deal with the Catholic problem, and his second barrier that he had to overcome, again, having a lot of momentum as a Democratic candidate, he had to overcome the age issue. Kennedy was young. He was 48 years young, 43 years young. Nixon was only 48. By the way, a lot is made of Kennedy's youth. Not much is made of Nixon's. They were only 5 years apart. Both were young. The difference is that Nixon had spent 8 years in the Oval Office. Kennedy had not yet spent a whole term in the Senate. JFK had to overcome the fact that he was going to be the youngest president in American history. By the way, Obama also, same age, I believe. JFK dealt with the age and experience issue throughout the campaign, and 2 points I want to make about it. First, he went on a full frontal assault using television advertisement. This is the beginning of television advertisement in political campaigns. He had a campaign ad song, which I'm not going to sing to you as just a public service. Said, "Who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new." So basically trying to spin that narrative of inexperience on its head and saying, well, my lack of experience is an asset. I don't have these old ways. I have these new ways of thinking. And that's what this country needs, is something new. We've had this old president in Eisenhower. We have these new problems, and I'm going to be the person to solve these new problems. The ads went some way to helping JFK to diffuse the age and experience issue. Much more so were the TV debates, which again I've linked to here in my lecture notes. JFK, much has been said about this, and some of it, the historical record seems to indicate, is overstated. There were 4 debates between JFK and Nixon. And in those debates, JFK looked young, but young and handsome, young and energetic, young and wicked smart, and young and competent. Nixon didn't look as good on the stage. He wasn't as good looking. He wasn't as telegenic. There are a lot of stories that come out of the televised debates of 1960. Most of them come from the first debate. I just want to share one little story from the first debate. Dick Nixon had jacked up his knee getting out of a car on the political campaign trail. He got a major infection. And because of the infection he had in his knee, he was running a fever in the day leading up to the first televised debate. And the Kennedy team reached out to the Nixon team and said, "Hey, look, if your man's not ready, we can postpone the debate. We wouldn't want him standing on stage with a fever. We want the fight to be fair, if you will." And of course, the Nixon team declined. Nixon wasn't going to look weak, right? Like, what if Khrushchev had proposed a debate and Nixon couldn't make it because his knee hurt, right? Like, obviously, and in a way, the Kennedy team was trying to put Nixon in a position to look weak. How much of their offer was benevolent versus political tomfoolery, it was up to you. Could be a little bit of both. So that gentlemanly outreach, if you will, was declined, and the gentlemanliness ended when the debate started. JFK took the stage, and his brother, Bobby, evidently went down to the custodian's room and said, it's way too cold in there. You have to turn up the heat. Some people say that he bribed the custodian. That's not substantiated, but I like the story. Could be true. And they turned up the heat. And then, as you see in this image, Richard Nixon starts to sweat. Now, Richard Nixon was kind of a notorious sweater anyway. He always had, a little bit of glow on his brow, and here he's wiping his upper lip. JFK was cool and calm and collected, and not a dollop of sweat on him. And so, because of that, people who watched the debate thought that Kennedy won the debate by a substantial margin. In fact, people who listened to the debate on the radio and couldn't see Nixon sweating thought that Nixon had won the debate. So, to some degree, the televised debates helped to erase the inexperience issue. Apparently, some of that is overstated. We don't want to say that Kennedy's victory was just a result of his success in the debates. There were a lot of other factors, but it played a role. And how decisive a role it was, well, it was a close election, right? In a population of 180 million, 34.2 million voted for Kennedy and 34.2 million voted for Nixon. It was 118,574 vote differential. That's 0.1%. Huzzah. Now, that's a tough position to be in, to walk into the Oval Office with, 118,574 vote victory. That's basically a margin of error. The other side of that, of course, is Kennedy won a a more substantial victory in the Electoral College, and that's what we count, right? So he won 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. Harry Byrd, the segregationist from Virginia, won 15 Electoral College votes. He's sort of the precursor to George Wallace, who we'll talk about in the next talk. So it looked like this. It's what we sometimes refer to as a checkerboard map. Kennedy and the Democrats in blue. You see how Lyndon Johnson helped to shore up some support in the Deep South. Dominated in the eastern seaboard, particularly the Northeast. So JFK won. He won fair and square. It was a tight race. Made some enemies along the way, one of whom became his vice president, and Richard Nixon resurged in 1968. In his inaugural speech, when he was inaugurated to be president, he demanded that the American people, we've all heard this one, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Every time I do it, it sounds to me like Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons doing an impression of JFK. Ask not, and I'll stop. It's terrible. All this will be not, no, sorry, I can't. All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor perhaps even in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. So this is the visionary leadership, and this is where we have to be, or I would urge us to be as sympathetic to the Kennedy platform as we can, the Kennedy vision. He saw what he was doing as part of the American liberal tradition, standing on the shoulders of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, building on that tradition and then sort of catapulting that. This was the future of America, and that he was going to be visionary, and that he wasn't going to be able to get it done in 100 or 1,000 days. But he believed that the American people had to start, and that they had to be hopeful. And so this notion of a new frontier with this Camelot optimism ultimately became federal aid to education, both urban and rural revitalization, housing, the minimum wage, and Medicare. And we're going to get to all of those. It's a new frontier for the American people. And look, there's some interesting social histories about the ways in which and the degree to which America felt fresh in 1961 after JFK was inaugurated. There were kids in the White House again. He was young. It was there was a lot of intrigue and mystery around the Kennedy family, and he had charm and grace, and his wife was something for the ages, and so there was a new feel. How widespread it was, again, is an interesting path of inquiry, not one that we can make too much time for today, but it's worth raising the question of how much the Camelot mystique translated to the average Arizonan or Montanan. To fulfill this robust agenda, Kennedy put together what he called the best and brightest, what the press dubbed the whiz kids. He was a Harvard boy. He had a lot of Harvard friends, Harvard connections. He put together a team of intellectuals and Ivy League superstars to help to lead America to the new frontier. JFK gets criticized by trying to associate himself with Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, JFK, going by the three initials. They were both Easterners. They both came from an elite class of politicians where politics was the family business, and that JFK was trying to create a New Deal for the American people, but there was no real crisis that demanded a New Deal. The American economy was humming along quite splendidly, uh, at a macro level, at least. It left a lot of people behind, and we'll talk about that. But there was no real crisis. So why do we need a New Deal when the old deal is working pretty well? Why do we need a New Deal when the most American people, according to many, were pretty happy with their lot in life? More and more Americans were getting suburban homes. They were able to afford a car. So they didn't really want a New Deal. Again, he won by 0.1%. But those who support Kennedy argue that he took the mentality of FDR's New Deal, the willingness to be flexible and to experiment, to apply the New Deal, to give a New Deal to those who were left behind during the New Deal, which is to say, most notably, African Americans and women. There was no New Deal for Black people. There was no New Deal for women. Yeah. So he wants to build on the New Deal and then expand it, a broader and deeper New Deal. That is effectively what the New Frontier is. And speaking of trying to bring the New Deal to a new subsection of the American population, we're going to talk most today about his civil rights agenda. And we're going to talk about his civil rights agenda and its limitations, most substantially because this is going to set a foundation for a lot of what we'll be doing in class in the forthcoming weeks, and it really dovetails with what we've been doing all year. On civil rights, JFK addressed civil rights from the outset. In his first State of the Union, upon taking office, one of the cornerstones of his speech was civil rights. And he said, the denial of constitutional rights to some of our fellow Americans on account of race, at the ballot box and elsewhere, disturbs the national conscience and subjects us to the charge of world opinion that our democracy is not equal to the high promise of our heritage. Two thoughts about that. The first is that JFK recognizes that the American people were grappling in an almost existential way with the problem of race. And it wasn't just Black people, it was all people. Americans were having to take a look in the mirror, a close look in the mirror. The economy was booming. They had, defeated purportedly, fascism and racism in World War II. And yet the problem of racism was still so endemic in America. And then the second point I want to make about this State of the Union remark is that for JFK and for LBJ, the desire to get straight, if you will, on America's original sin of slavery and endemic racism had something to do with the way the world looked at America, the way that communist countries looked at America. It was hard for presidents to speak, to go out in the world and speak about democracy when the race problem in America, such as it was, continued, persisted, and in some cases just got worse. And it wasn't just talking to communist leaders, it was talking to so-called third world leaders who were tempted by communism, but who were also tempted by capitalism. So as a foreign policy measure, getting right on race was really important. Now, I'm not saying that that was the primary motivator for JFK and LBJ, but it mattered, and it's not to be ignored. The Soviet press and the communist Chinese press had a field day with American racism. The only news that most Russians got were, front page of, black kids getting beaten over the head by the police at the Woolworths lunch counter. And that's democracy for you. That's what you get when you have capitalism. So, how much the average Soviet citizen swallowed that propaganda is definitely not in the purview of this lecture, but it's worth seeing the civil rights agenda in the context of the Cold War. Yeah. So, from the outset, Kennedy makes civil rights a centerpiece of his new frontier. And he says, couple years later, 2.5 years later, in June of 1963, that the fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. Redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It's not enough to pin the blame on others and say this is the problem of one section of the country or another. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. So in his 2.5 years in office, going from his first State of the Union to this TV address in June of 1963, when a march on Washington is being planned, huzzah, JFK points out wisely and appropriately that the race problem in America is not a Southern problem, it's an American problem. And that it's not a political crisis per se, it's a moral crisis. So what I wanted to do here is to walk you through his first State of the Union to June of 1963. So 2.5 years of what did Kennedy do? How did he get from one to the other? Well, very quickly upon coming to office, he signed into law the 23rd Amendment, which gave 3 electoral votes to the Federal District of Columbia. This amendment was proposed in Congress, and Eisenhower was behind it. It didn't get through the state ratification process. Both parties were for the 23rd Amendment, but JFK was able to, walk that football across into the end zone. In case you're not aware, the District of Columbia at the time, in the 1970 census, the District of Columbia was 71% African American. So giving people, residents of DC, the right to have their votes counted in a presidential election was and is a matter of civil rights, right? So, he got the pleasure of signing an amendment to the Constitution, which had a real impact on race. The 24th Amendment, the next year, banned poll taxes. That was ratified after JFK had passed. Lyndon Johnson signed that bill into law, sort of with the ghost of JFK beside him. So if Eisenhower really deserves credit, if Eisenhower and the Democratic Congress deserve credit for the 23rd, then Kennedy deserves credit for the 24th. But Kennedy was not so with the 23rd and the 24th in mind, the first he didn't initiate and the second he didn't sign, JFK was deeply afraid, probably for good reason, that the civil rights movement would alienate Southern whites and alienate the Democrats from the Southern states in Congress. And this is really important for us to meditate on for just a moment. Look, JFK was a politician. He came from a family of politicians. He had a long-term vision, as we've discussed. And his vision was for civil rights to be a second term affair. He thought during his first term he would talk about civil rights, that he would, change the dialogue, that he would open the Overton window, that he would be welcoming to African Americans and African American leaders in the civil rights movement, but that in terms of really putting boots on the ground and getting legislation passed, that was a second term affair. He was afraid, again, perhaps rightly, that if you made it a first term affair, that there wouldn't be a second term. So we either give JFK credit for having a long-term vision. We want our leaders not to play whack-a-mole with politics, but to have a strategic long-term vision that's flexible but firm. So we can give him credit for that, or we can say he lacked the courage to tackle the country's most prominent issue when he got into office, and that he paid it lip service but didn't deliver. And when you assess the Kennedy legacy, you have to deal with that. And whatever side of that you come down on, whatever your thesis is in response to JFK on civil rights, is yours. His brother was with him on this. Bobby Kennedy, as the Attorney General, said that the president has to be, quote, we have to keep the president out of the civil rights mess. He told the Freedom Riders who were seeking integration in the buses in the South to, quote, get off the buses and leave the matter to peaceful settlement in the courts. Which, of course, is what you would want the Attorney General to say, right? You want to live in a nation of laws, but when that nation of laws systematically and fundamentally undermines the basic human dignity of the African American population, there is an argument for defying the laws. Where you stand on that argument is not going to be successfully addressed today. Later. So there's no doubt that JFK became more engaged in the struggle for civil rights in 1963, when the Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked the doors to Black people at the University of Alabama. JFK was able to negotiate through some force the right for the Brown versus Board of Education ruling to be enforced in Alabama. But that wasn't enough for Martin Luther King Jr. and the Big Six leaders who planned the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August of '63. This is where King gave his perfect "I Have a Dream" speech. There's this brilliant moment that I think about quite frequently. I have to imagine it. Imagine the Lincoln Monument, and Abraham Lincoln perched splendidly. Bobby Kennedy, JFK, and Martin Luther King, JFK, RFK, and MLK. In literally standing in the shadows of the Lincoln Memorial, where Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy are trying to convince Martin Luther King Jr. to tone down his rhetoric. That his soaring rhetoric for this "I Have a Dream" speech, it was going to ignite pandemonium. That it's going to create chaos in the streets. That in effect he's asking for a revolution. And King, of course, dutifully listens, like, I understand. Yes. We'll keep the fiery rhetoric down. I understand, Mr. President. I understand. By this time, they had developed a relationship. And Martin Luther King goes out there and he delivers the most rousing speech in American history, a speech for the ages. And JFK could have shown more support for that. Now, a lot of what JFK did set the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we'll talk about when we get to the Kennedy years. The Johnson years. It's the most important piece of civil rights legislation probably since the 13th Amendment, right? Which freed the slaves. So to some degree, JFK deserves credit for that, to a substantial degree. But then again, the other side, I keep on vacillating here, but that's what I do. It's what I do. It's what they pay me, not much, but they pay me for. So just to, again, seeing the other side of it, the Kennedy administration and the Attorney General office and the FBI under JFK was harassing Martin Luther King Jr. with a sort of reckless abandon. They were terrorizing him. They were wiretapping him. They were following him around. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, he called Martin Luther King the most dangerous man in America, repeatedly. In one particular nasty affair, the FBI was penning letters to Martin Luther King Jr., suggesting humbly that he commit suicide. Why should he commit suicide? Because the writer, turned out to be the FBI, was aware that the Reverend, Dr. King, was having extramarital affairs, and that it would be better for him to kill himself, or better yet, to stage his own assassination, than to deal with the fallout when it is revealed that he was a serial philanderer. He was with all sorts of women. That's that stands in on the legacy sheet of the FBI. JFK and RFK did empower the Hoover FBI to terrorize Martin Luther King Jr. And as we're assessing his civil rights legacy, it's hard to avoid that uncomfortable fact. I mean, it's obviously the case that JFK was not able to solve the civil rights problem, and who could have in 3 years. And it's clearly the case that after JFK left office, that the civil rights movement really took off, and it became more complicated. It also became more violent and more contentious. JFK did not solve the civil rights problem, but neither did any president in the 100 years since slavery had been abolished. He did change the tone, and he could have done more had he lived. So again, do with the civil rights legacy of JFK as you wish, but do it honestly. Yeah. And I don't think there's much need for cynicism or glorification. Perhaps a healthy intellectual skepticism, but dig into the record. Don't take my word for any of this. What do I know? All right. So that's on civil rights. JFK had spent less time thinking about women's rights. I think he did. I think it's clear that he did change the tone again he created some space for the women's rights movement. In 1961, he hired FDR's wife, the widow of FDR, to head the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. This commission, which got a lot of support from JFK, though not as much time perhaps as critics might hope, made it clear how women were fundamentally and systematically discriminated against in politics, in culture, and in the economy. They created the Equal Pay Act, which was an amendment to FDR's Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935. I think it was 1935. I'll look it up. If I'm wrong, I'll put it in my show notes here. And JFK endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment, which never did pass. It was ultimately cut short in 1982, and we'll talk about that in a later talk, a later venue. But JFK had clearly a greater empathy for and interest in the political, economic, and social struggles that women faced than did his predecessors. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt was trying to get her husband to be more visionary on women's rights and, incidentally, to be more visionary on civil rights. She, throughout the New Deal and the war effort, was trying to get FDR to be more proactive on Black and women's rights. And so bringing her, and she was, by the way, she was pretty open about it. And so bringing her into the Oval Office to chair this commission had a symbolic appeal. Yeah. So that's just a quick set of thoughts on the role that JFK played in trying to open the Overton window to dialogues about women, women's rights, and women's dignity. And of course, that was situated in the broader context of economic human rights. JFK said, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. So with that spirit in mind, he raised the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25 an hour. I should say that the minimum wage is almost meaningless now. But then a single breadwinner could raise a family of four. It wouldn't be easy, but they could raise a family of four on a single $1.25 an hour income. The minimum wage had a greater economic support then than it did now. The minimum wage has not scaled over the years. Yeah. He passed the Revenue Act of 1964, which cut taxes. The top marginal rate when he took office was 91%. So during the Republican 1950s, the Eisenhower administration, the top 5% of Americans paid 91% of their income in taxes. So JFK reduced that to 70%, and the corporate tax rate went down 4%. Again, I remind you that marginal tax rates, while important symbolically and economically, it's more important how well the IRS and how efficiently and effectively the IRS collects those taxes, maybe than the marginal tax rate. If the tax rate is 91%, but the federal government isn't really enforcing it, so that because of loopholes and poor enforcement, the top 5% of Americans are effectively paying 22% instead of 91%. That doesn't do anyone any favors. So I want to remind you of that. And I also want to remind you that the so-called greatest generation of Americans had marginal tax rates that are 2-3 times higher than what we have now. And that's not, by the way, a prescription for raising taxes, but it's worth considering that Americans, the wealthiest Americans, used to pay taxes in a way much different than what we see today. By the way, I'm not saying they were happy about it, but they paid them. Also on the economic frontier, JFK signed into law the Housing Act of 1961, which created for federal funding of public transportation and public housing in American cities. Obviously, American public transportation is nothing to celebrate, but he got the ball rolling in that direction. LBJ did more on that. The Housing Act subsidized middle-class housing in the hope to keep middle-class people in the cities, trying to keep middle-class people from running out to the suburbs, leaving the cities to become sort of like a vast wasteland, which some argue they did. The Housing Act of 61 further paid locales and American metropolises to keep open space. Filming here in Berlin, one thing that Berliners love and that I love about Berlin is all of the open space that we have. There are a lot of developers who would love to, build luxury condos in the Tiergarten. And fortunately, the government doesn't allow that to happen. The same was true of American cities in the 60s. There was a desire to develop, but he paid cities, subsidized cities to keep space open so that cities had room to breathe. And lastly, the Housing Act of 61 subsidized housing for the elderly. He also was the first president to really, in a robust way, fund education. Education was largely the prerogative of local governments and, on occasion, state governments. But he was firmly of the opinion that if America was going to achieve these new frontiers that he was so adamant about pursuing, that all American children needed a high quality, world class education. And if the states weren't going to, if states and locales weren't going to offer that, that the federal government would step in. Yeah. So, having walked through the civil rights part of the new frontier and women's rights and economic frontiers, want to talk about the new frontier, space as the frontier. And of course, space as both like a metaphor for pursuing the seemingly impossible, but also space as a very pragmatic pursuit. I couldn't resist, by the way, titling this slide not too long ago. Gil Scott-Heron, who's this splendid musical artist, he passed away. He wrote this song called Whitey on the Moon in the early 70s. I think it came out in 71. Saying like, we have all these problems in the Black communities. We have all these, we have this Cold War going on. Oh, but Whitey, he's on the moon. Thank God there's a white guy in space while we Black people are down here suffering the indignities of endemic segregation and discrimination. I don't know how much credence you want to give that, but it's a perspective. So in sort of a shout out to Gil Scott-Heron, there's your title on the slide. So in 61, the Soviet Yuri Gagarin goes into space, and Kennedy goes the next month to Congress, and he gives this urgent message saying, this nation should commit itself, to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him to space, returning him to Earth. So listen, I know we all inhabit a world where, we're pinging things to satellites and we're talking about going to Mars, and, we have rockets flying in outer space all the time. It's amazing. It's a miracle. It's unbelievable that a man walked on the moon, that humans are traversing space, that we're exploring the galaxy. This is, it's unbelievable. It's literally unbelievable. It's so heartening and inspiring, and it just shows that anything is possible. And so whereas we all, of course, we walk on the moon. It happened. That's old news. It's really a beautiful, sentimental prospect. We're going to send a man to the moon. He's going to come back to Earth and tell us what it was like up there. So this is Kennedy inspiring the imagination of young people. And you think about young boys and girls who are like, one day I'm going to go to the moon. The president said that we're going to go to the moon, and I'm going to be the one. And the little kids running around their yards with makeshift spacesuits. So that's sort of the symbolic appeal of the moon, but also the very real and pragmatic effect of it is that Kennedy funded NASA and gave, hundreds of billions of dollars when it was all said and done to science and technology programs to make America the technology leader of the world, hands down. The legacy of that is in Silicon Valley today, Silicon Valley, Seattle, you name it. And that way of thinking about the world and the training that American children got in thinking about scientific, technological, engineering, and mathematical problems is a legacy of the new frontier. It's a legacy of the Kennedy domestic agenda. Also, a legacy is the Peace Corps. Remember that Americans should pay any price, Annie Burden. I just can't resist it. My Mayor Quimby. Kennedy created the Peace Corps. This was something that he had wanted back in the 1950s. When he was a senator, he had wanted to have some sort of an international civil service. The image you see here is of JFK at the University of Michigan in 1957, talking to young people about, would you want to be part of something like this? That international civil service, when he became president, became the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, if you don't know, is where young volunteers go to less developed countries as engineers and healthcare workers and teachers, and they help to develop countries that haven't managed to develop on their own. There's two ways you could look at the Peace Corps, right? If you want to be a cynic, you could just say it's the Cold War, and the U.S. is just trying to cast its image as, the patriarch of the world, and it's just trying to influence these countries so they don't become communist. And there's some truth to that, sure. The other side is a more optimistic and innocent view of the world where, look, America became the richest country in the history of the world, and she wanted to share some of her wealth and knowledge with countries that hadn't been able to enjoy the blessings of economic modernity. So somewhere between the more optimistic and the more cynical views, you probably have some truth. Do what you will with that. But the Peace Corps is a firm testament to his legacy. I myself know a number of people who have been in the Peace Corps, and some of the best people I know. So I don't know what that says. I don't even know why I told you that, but I guess I'm not so cynical about the Peace Corps. Such are my biases, of which I might have a few. So despite this robust new frontier agenda, old problems still lingered. Part of those problems lingered because LBJ did not do a sufficient job of keeping together the Southern Democratic Coalition. Medicare was defeated. So JFK had proposed a public option healthcare program. Harry Truman had tried to run that across the goal line in the early 1950s. He failed. JFK failed. Lyndon Johnson succeeded. The American Medical Association and their spokesperson, Ronald Reagan, would not have this. Medicaid never even got to the floor of Congress. So Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid is for the poor. Civil rights, clearly some of those problems continue to linger. Mass transit and public transportation in America was not solved by the Kennedy administration. Look, there was a lot of unfinished business. Yeah. And had he more than 1,000 days, perhaps a lot of that business would have been finished. Here is a political cartoon from the time. The end of 1962, Kennedy having, sliding into 1963, his Democratic donkey collapsed. He lost the support of Congress. You see the Congress is rolled up on the ground, and Kennedy, with his new frontier tenacity, giddy up. Ugh, it's not going to happen. Oh my gosh, I just realized the arrow in the hat, that's sort of prophetic and sad. Now I feel kind of insensitive. Kennedy's, narrowly dodging arrows, and things don't look good for Kennedy in 63. So, critical of his momentum going into 63, he was losing some support, which we'll talk, but he gained, but not too much, as you'll see here. So here's John F. Kennedy, who enjoyed some of the highest approval ratings in modern presidential history. At its peak, he had 83%. Here's George H.W. Bush, who right after the Soviet Union collapsed enjoyed an 89% approval rating, but his approval rating went down to 29% by the time he was set to leave office. So very high, but very low. And his son, the Shrub, George W. Bush enjoyed an 86% approval rating. That did not last long. So after 9/11, George W. Bush had the support of the lion's share of the American population. But by the time he was set to leave office, he had the lowest approval ratings in modern presidential history. JFK, overall, his approval ratings were the highest of all presidents of the era. He never lost the support of the majority of Americans. He is the only president in modern history who has not lost the support of the majority of Americans. His approval ratings were always 56% above or higher. Now, what does that say exactly? Well, you can interpret that as you wish. How much does American public opinion matter? Well, in a democracy, it matters for something. It does say something when one's approval ratings are that consistently high. It doesn't say everything, right? The perception of the American people does not necessarily meet the reality, nor do the perceptions of historians and commentators. I want to put myself rather uncomfortably here between Ross Douthat and Bobby Kennedy. I want to give two assessments, one modern and one of the time, of the Kennedy legacy. First, some criticism from Ross Douthat, who is sort of like the token conservative columnist at the New York Times. And in an op-ed he wrote in November of 2011 called "The Enduring Cult of Kennedy." Strong, but such is the editorialist. He says, Douthat says, "The premise is that Kennedy was a very good president, and he might have been a great one if he'd lived. Very few serious historians take this view. In reality, the kindest interpretation of Kennedy's presidency is that he was a mediocrity, whose death left his final grade as incomplete." A mediocrity. The harsher view, so he's going to get harsher now, would deem him a near disaster, ineffective in domestic policy, evasive on civil rights, and a serial blunderer on foreign policy, who barely avoided a nuclear war that his own brinkmanship had pushed us toward. We, the American people, confuse charisma with competence, rhetoric with results, and celebrity with genuine achievement. So that's a pretty scathing indictment of the Kennedy legacy. There's some truth to it. Bobby Kennedy's brother in 1966 challenges that. He says, "But if there was one thing that President Kennedy stood for that touched the most profound feeling of young people around the world, it was the belief that idealism, high aspirations, and deep convictions are not incompatible with the most practical and efficient of programs. That there's no basic inconsistency between ideals and realistic possibilities. No separation between the deepest desires of the heart and the mind, and the rational application of human effort to human problems." So, yeah, there was soaring rhetoric, there was idealism, there was aspiration, there was deep convictions, but that stuff matters. We want vision, right? We want to grapple with both the heart and the mind. So these two assessments of JFK's legacy could not be more in contradiction. Of course, it's really hard to gauge Kennedy's legacy because, of course, very sadly, he was assassinated. And before we get to the assassination, I do just want to take a brief snapshot, very brief, of Kennedy's foreign policy. Again, the Peace Corps we already talked about. The Alliance for Progress he created, a 10-point program of international relations between Latin American countries it kind of became a series of bilateral relationships between the U.S. and Latin American countries. It didn't work out well. In 1961, he sought to overthrow Castro violently, and he failed. A lot of egg on his face there. The Berlin crisis, the wall goes up. And look, I'll say it. It's hard to imagine Khrushchev putting up a wall if a more seasoned American president were in power. I don't know what JFK could have or should have done about the wall going up. I don't know if it was his situation to solve. But there might have been a more sane resolution to that problem. It doesn't go well on his record. The Cuban Missile Crisis, you could argue that Kennedy successfully resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis. You could also argue that he created it in trying to continually overthrow Castro. He created this special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, which exists to this day. And in '63, he successfully signed the nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. The big foreign policy mark on his legacy, if not Berlin, was Vietnam. He introduced American troops into Vietnam. He threw America on the back of that Asian tiger, and America was never able to successfully dismount. That said, that was Mr. Johnson's war, but Kennedy started that fire. And my least favorite part here, I hate to have to do it. In November of 1963, JFK, in an effort to shore up support for civil rights legislation, went down to Texas to do his job, to try to get Southerners on the civil rights bandwagon. In traveling in a motorcade, his life was taken by one Lee Harvey Oswald, who was in turn killed by Jack Ruby. The Chief Justice Earl Warren was charged with the task of leading a commission to determine exactly what happened down in Texas on that awful November afternoon. And the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, that there was no second gunman, that there was no conspiracy of sorts. And I should say that I don't have much interest left in conspiracy theories around the Kennedy assassination. It is my humble estimation that there are already too many books taking up valuable shelf space in American libraries and bookstores on this matter. Of course, if you're interested in such matters, there's thus a whirlwind of opinions for you to sift through. But what matters most to me here is that here is Lyndon Johnson in a somber moment and a tragic moment, particularly for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who stands beside him. This is LBJ taking the oath of office on Air Force One before returning to DC to get his work done. Of course, JFK's legacy would be substantially different had he lived. But I challenge you, I urge you, I implore you indeed to try to make sense of the Kennedy legacy. It's complicated, it's convoluted. He definitely left an indelible mark on America. And what that mark is up to you to determine. I will look forward to talking to you about the presidency of this man here, Lyndon Johnson, who, as you probably know by now, I have an irrational fondness for. We will get into the Johnson years in our next talk. I look forward to seeing you then. Please take care, stay healthy, be well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.